Hi, welcome to Chromosphere IAS Academy. Today's trending topic are 1. France protests over pension reforms. 2. Changes to Prevention of Money Laundering Act. 3. Grievances of paramilitary forces. 4. The wide disparities in human development. 5. OilMin accepts all major Kirit Parikh panel recommendations on gas pricing. 6. How India's sugar shipments to the world are surging. 7. Synthesis report of IPCC AR6. 8. ICMR releases guidelines for artificial intelligence use in the health sector. Our first topic is France protests over pension reforms. This topic is related to GS Paper 2 International. GS Paper 3 Economy. Protesters in France clashed with police near the National Assembly building in Paris on March 17. Nationwide demonstrations have been ongoing over the government's decision to raise the state pension age from 62 to 64. Although protests have been mostly peaceful, there have been incidents of riot police and protesters clashing. The government used a special provision in the constitution to push through the pension reform without holding a vote in the National Assembly, leading to uproar and protests in parliament. What does the new pension reform seek to do? In France, all retirees get a state pension. This is how the system works. Mandatory payroll taxes paid by those currently working fund the pensions of retirees, meaning generations have been able to retire with an assured, state-backed pension. Now, the government argues that as life expectancy in France increases and so does its aging population, meaning more retirees than new entrants into the workforce, the current pension system will fall short in the coming decades. While there were 2.1 workers putting money into the system for every one retiree in 2000, this figure dropped to 1.7 workers per retiree in 2020, and is expected to further slide to 1.2 by 2070. The government says the measure to gradually raise the legal retirement age by 3 months every year, till it reaches 64 by 2030, is indispensable in order to balance the pension system and keep it financially viable. The change in retirement age from the current 62 to 64 means that people will have to work longer or contribute payroll taxes for a greater number of years to get a full state pension. The government also says it will put in place a seniors index to check if companies are making progress in hiring and training seniors so that they don't get left out as the retirement age increases. The reform will also put an end to a dozen or so special regimes with different retirement ages and benefits for different categories of workers, including rail workers, electricity and gas workers, and central bank staff. However, the changes will only apply to new workers in these sectors. The government has stated that new retirees will get a guaranteed minimum pension of not less than 85% of the total minimum wage, about €1,200 per month at current levels. In the present system, many women who pause their careers to raise children and people who study for longer and start their careers late, must work till the age of 67 to retire with full pension benefits. Why has this made people angry? The French cherish the retirement system, as well as national health care, as it is seen as hard-earned, having been introduced by the National Resistance Council after the Second World War. Generations of workers have accepted high mandatory taxes to fund the pension system because it creates interdependence and guarantees state-backed pension earnings. The new system means current workers will have to work longer to sustain pensions for the ballooning aged population. Observers also worry that the reform will negatively affect blue-collar workers who often start working young, have shorter life expectancies, or have less optimum working conditions compared to white-collar workers. Opponents of the reform argue that instead of altering the pension age, the government could have balanced the system through other measures, like increasing payroll taxes paid by workers, taxing the wealthy more, or not tying pensions to inflation. So far 8 coordinated nationwide protests have taken place since mid-January along with regular demonstrations by civilians and a coordinated group of labor unions in various parts of the country. Pension reforms have long been a contentious issue in French politics, having prompted widespread protests in 1995 and 2010. Next topic is changes to Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Money laundering is related to GS Paper 2 governance. GS Paper 3 security. Recently Finance Ministry placed all transactions involving virtual digital assets, VDA, under the purview of PMLA. About PMLA. The law was enacted by the Indian Parliament in 2002, and it came into effect on 1 July 2005. Defines money laundering as any process or activity that involves the proceeds of crime and is intended to conceal or disguise the nature, source, location, disposition, movement or ownership of such proceeds. Provides for the establishment of a Financial Intelligence Unit, FIU, to receive, analyze and disseminate information relating to suspicious transactions to the concerned authorities. Empowers the authorities to freeze, seize, and confiscate the proceeds of crime, including movable and immovable property, bank accounts, and financial instruments, among others. Provides for the appointment of an adjudicating authority to adjudicate whether any property is involved in money laundering. Specifies certain offences, including drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, and organized crime, as predicate offences for money laundering. Imposes obligations on reporting entities, including banks, financial institutions, and intermediaries, to maintain records and submit reports on suspicious transactions to the authorities. Establishes a special court to try offences under the Act and provides for stringent punishment, including imprisonment and fines, for money laundering offences. Money laundering is the process of making large amounts of money generated by criminal activity, such as drug trafficking or terrorist funding, appear to have come from a legitimate source. What are the recent changes in the PMLA? Bringing 5 types of activities under PMLA. Exchange between virtual digital assets, VDA, and fiat currencies. Exchange between one or more forms of VDA. Transfer of VDA. Safekeeping or administration of VDA or instruments enabling control over them. Participation in and provision of financial services related to an issuer's offer and sale of a VDA. Changes in the prevention of money laundering, maintenance of records, rules, 2005. Defining the term politically exposed person, PEP. Every banking company or financial institution shall register the details of clients on the DARPAN portal of Niti Aayog. The rules broadens the definition of a non-profit organization to now also include organizations that function for charitable purposes including relief to the poor, education or medical relief etc. The new rules add more data retention requirements to NGOs. VDA is any data, code, number, or token generated using cryptography or another method. Fiat currencies are government-issued currency that is not backed by a physical commodity, such as gold or silver, but rather by the government that issued it. What are the impacts of changes in PMLA? Impact on crypto exchanges. For crypto exchanges, the changes mean that if they carry out activities related to the exchange of virtual digital assets, VDAs, for another person, it will be considered an activity under PMLA. Additionally, crypto exchanges will have to verify the identity of their clients and beneficial owners, and maintain records of transactions for 5 years from the date of the transaction. They also have to maintain records of identity, files, and correspondences of clients for 5 years. Impact on foreign portfolio investors. For foreign portfolio investors, FPIs, the changes mean that they will have to rework their mechanism for maintaining records because of the change in the threshold for determining beneficial ownership. This means that FPIs will have to adjust their records to meet the new requirements under PMLA. Overall, these changes reflect the government's efforts to strengthen the fight against money laundering and other financial crimes in India. Next topic is grievances of paramilitary forces, which is related to GS Paper 2 governance. GS Paper 3 security. Old age pension is not given to paramilitary personnel who died in Pulwama attack. About paramilitary forces. A semi-militarist force whose organizational structure, tactics, training, subculture, and often functions are similar to those of a professional military but which is not included as part of a country's formal armed forces. Though paramilitary is not a military force, it is usually like military's light infantry force in terms of training and organizational structure. All the paramilitary forces comes under Ministry of Home Affairs. Following are the various paramilitary forces in India. The Assam Rifles, Central Industrial Security Forces, CISF, Central Reserve Police Force, CRPF, Indo-Tibetan Border Police, ITBP, Force, National Security Guard, Border Security Forces, Sashastra Seema Bal, other forces Special Frontier Force, Cabinet Secretariat, and Indian Coast Guard, Ministry of Defence. Various problems faced by paramilitary forces. Lack of training and skills. Allegation of poor quality of food. Shortage of gazetted officers, GOs, and personnel. The old pension scheme not being provided to personnel joining service after 31st December 2003. What is the need of the hour? Paramilitary forces needed to be treated in par with armed forces. The morale of these paramilitary military personnel needs to be kept high. The genuine grievances of India's paramilitary forces need to be addressed. Let's see the wide disparities in human development reports shows about India. GS Paper 2 Social Justice Human Development. Context: India is now one of the fastest growing economies globally. However, this growth has not resulted in a corresponding increase in its Human Development Index, HDI. About Human Development Index. The HDI is a composite statistical measure created by the United Nations Development Programme to evaluate and compare the level of human development in different regions around the world. It was introduced in 1990 as an alternative to conventional economic measures such as gross domestic product, GDP, which do not consider the broader aspects of human development. The HDI assesses a country's average accomplishment in 3 aspects: a long and healthy life, knowledge, and a decent standard of living. Human Development Report 2021-22. According to the Human Development Report of 2021-22, India ranks 132 out of 191 countries, behind Bangladesh, 129, and Sri Lanka, 73. The HDI scores range from 0 to 1, with higher values indicating higher levels of human development. The subnational HDI in India shows that while some states have made considerable progress, others continue to struggle. Delhi occupies the top spot and Bihar occupies the bottom spot. The 5 states with the highest HDI scores are Delhi, Goa, Kerala, Sikkim, and Chandigarh. 19 states are classified as high human development states, while the bottom 5 states are Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, and Assam, with medium levels of human development. Reasons for the wide disparity. Economic growth has been unevenly distributed in India. The top 10% of the Indian population holds over 77% of the wealth. Quality of education, healthcare and basic amenities remain a concern. Not prioritizing human development alongside economic growth. Improving access to quality social services. Addressing environmental challenges. India must prioritize investments in human development and job creation, particularly for its youth. OilMin accepts all major Kirit Parikh panel recommendations on gas pricing. GS Paper 3 Economy, Energy. Context. The Petroleum and Natural Gas Ministry has accepted the main recommendations of the Kirit Parikh Committee on Natural Gas Pricing, and will be further recommended by them to the Cabinet soon. What is the Kirit Parikh Committee? The committee was constituted last year, 2022, to review the existing pricing formula for domestically produced natural gas in India. The current method of gas pricing. At present, the government fixes the prices of gas produced from the old fields of state-run ONGC and oil. These both account for about 80% of the annual gas output of 91 billion cubic meters in India. Need for revision of gas pricing. To ensure a reliable pricing regime, a price band will ensure a predictable pricing regime for producers and protect consumers by moderating CNG and PNG price spikes. To raise domestic production, a better price will incentivize more investment and help raise domestic production. India targets 15% of energy coming from gas by 2030. Helps in improving the environment. Dependence on coal and oil needs to be reduced. Major recommendations of the committee description. Fixed ceiling price, till 2027. Implement a fixed pricing band for APM, administrative price mechanism, gas from old fields. The old fields account for 2/3 of natural gas produced in India. Currently, government controls the price of gas produced from old fields. By 2027. Move to a purely market-determined natural gas pricing system by 2027. Linking the price. Link the domestic gas price to 10% of the cost of imported crude oil. No-cut category, uninterrupted supply. Some of the sectors have been kept in the no-cut category, meaning that supplies will remain uninterrupted in this category even in case of a decline in production. E.g., the city gas and fertilizer sector will continue to get top priority in the allocation of APM gas. Inclusion of gas in GST. Include gas in GST with compensation for 5 years. Removal of caps on gas prices. Remove caps on gas prices within 3 years. Gradual exit from gas allocation business. Government should gradually exit out of the gas allocation business. No changes to the existing pricing formula for new fields and fields with difficult geology. New and difficult fields enjoy pricing freedom to compensate for the greater risk and cost involved in these projects, but they have a pricing cap. The report suggests that the upper cap should be removed from 1st January 2026. E.g., for fields in the deep sea or in high temperature, high pressure zones. Impact of the move. Good for domestic producers. It will benefit domestic producers of natural gas in India, as they will now be able to receive a higher price for their products. Will incentivize domestic production and lead to an increase in domestic supply. Will make the pricing of natural gas more transparent and efficient. This will help raise the share of gas in India's energy mix to 15% by 2030 from around 4% at present. About Administrative Price Mechanism, APM. To prevent hoarding, maintain the prices of essential goods, such as gas, at reasonable levels, and ensure their easy availability, the government fixes the prices of certain commodities. This is known as the Administered Price Mechanism. About natural gas. Natural gas, also called methane gas or natural methane gas, is a colorless, highly flammable gaseous hydrocarbon consisting primarily of methane and ethane. It is a type of petroleum that commonly occurs in association with crude oil. It can be used as a domestic and industrial fuel. How India's sugar shipments to the world are surging. GS Paper 3 Syllabus, Agriculture. Context: India has become world number 2 in sugar export, behind only Brazil. Data. India's sugar export, in 2016-17, was 0.46 lakh tons, Lieutenant, which has now increased to 110 Lieutenant by 2021-22. India is the world's largest producer and consumer of sugar. Importers of Indian raw sugar, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Saudi Arabia. Types of sugar. Raw brown sugar. Raw sugar is what mills produce after the first crystallization of juice obtained from the crushing of cane. This sugar is rough and brownish in color. Most of the world's sugar trade is in raws, and they can be transported in bulk vessels and requires no bagging or containerization. Till 2017-18, India hardly exported any raw sugar. Refined white sugar, raw sugar after being processed in refineries for the removal of impurities and decolorization. Advantages of Indian raw sugar in the international market. Season advantage. India's crushing is from October to April, whereas Brazilian mills operate from April to November. Hence, importers are utilizing Indian raw sugar during Brazil's off-season. Freight cost savings. India is much closer to its major sugar importers, compared to Brazil, and therefore less freight cost. Indian sugar is free of dextran. Dextran is a bacterial compound formed when sugar cane stays in the sun for too long after harvesting. Indian raw sugar has no dextran, as it is produced from fresh cane crushed within 12 to 24 hours of harvesting, compared to 48 hours or more in Brazil. India's sugar has a higher percent of sucrose present. Government policies for higher sugar production. Pricing. Fair and remunerative price, FRP. The FRP is the minimum price that sugar mills have to pay to sugarcane farmers for the procurement of sugarcane. State-advised price. Although the central government decides the FRP, the state governments can also set a state-advised price that a sugar mill has to pay to the farmers. Encouraging ethanol production to be used in ethanol blending with petrol, EBP, program. Scheme for extending financial assistance to sugar undertakings, CEFASU. National Policy on Biofuels 2018. Concerns. Lower stocks, lower production and concerns about domestic availability and food inflation have led the government to cap India's exports in the current sugar year. However, once the overseas markets are lost, they are not easy to regain. Conclusion: Rangarajan Committee, 2012, has recommended the abolition of the quantitative controls on the export and import of sugar. These should be replaced by appropriate tariffs. Synthesis Report of IPCC AR6. GS Paper 3 Syllabus: Conservation, Environmental Pollution and Degradation, Environmental Impact Assessment. Context: according to an IPCC report, climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health, and a window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all is fast closing. Background: through its multiple assessment cycles beginning in 1990, the IPCC has analyzed research by scientists on global warming, the role humans have had in exacerbating it, the long-term climate impact from current and future emissions, and what people can do about it. The IPCC does not itself undertake scientific assessments but only evaluates the state of scientific evidence on various aspects of climate change. The Sixth Assessment Report, AR6, assesses scientific, technical, and socio-economic information concerning climate change. About the Synthesis Report: this is the final report of the AR6, which integrates findings from 6 reports, 3 working groups plus 3 special reports, released by IPCC during the cycle which began in 2015. Highlights of the Synthesis Report of the AR6. 6 key messages for policymakers. Excess emissions from human activities have raised global temperature by 1.1 degrees Celsius above 1850 to 1900. Current policy action will lead to further temperature rise, and the impacts on humans and other forms of life will become more severe. At current emissions levels, we will deplete the remaining carbon budget of 500 GTCO2. We need to cut GHG emissions across all sectors urgently, within this decade and no later. We have all the solutions we need to shift to low-carbon economic systems. These include widespread electrification, diversifying energy generation to include more wind, solar, and small-scale hydropower, deploying more battery-powered electric vehicles, and conserving and restoring forests while also reducing tropical deforestation. Political commitment and equity are key to enabling this shift. There is enough finance. It needs to be directed to climate action. Challenges: overshooting 1.5 degrees Celsius, expected in the early 2030s, will result in irreversible adverse impacts on certain ecosystems with low resilience, polar, mountain, coastal ecosystems, etc. Adaptation gaps exist and will continue to grow if no action is taken, and the lower income group will suffer the most. Though developed countries commit to jointly mobilize $100 billion in climate finance annually, current global financial flows for adaptation are insufficient. Some parts of the world, tropical, coastal, polar and mountain ecosystems, have already reached their adaptation limits. This means adaptive actions cannot avoid negative impacts there. There is increased evidence of maladaptation, changes in natural human systems that inadvertently increase vulnerability to climate stimuli, in various sectors and regions. For example, mangrove plantation in coastal Odisha has disturbed the local ecosystems, affecting marginalized and vulnerable groups adversely. There are multiple barriers, variable impacts, risks and co-benefits in deploying them, to implementing carbon capture and storage, CCS, a climate change mitigation tool that removes CO2 from the atmosphere. Implications of the report for India: increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events could have dire consequences for agriculture, the economy and public health. Opportunity: there is a 50-50 chance that by 2030, the global surface temperature in any individual year could exceed 1.5 C. Recent efforts: the Loss and Damage (LD) Finance Facility, which came into prominence during the COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, to the UNFC, aims to provide financial assistance to nations most vulnerable and impacted by the effects of climate change. Way ahead: engaging public-private sector to mobilize sufficient finances. Citizens must be provided with climate literacy to drive political commitment, research and urgency towards adaptation. Enabling conditions such as policy instruments, greater public support and technological innovation could reduce barriers to CCS. The policymakers must prioritize investments in disaster risk reduction, including early warning systems, evacuation plans, and infrastructure development to protect vulnerable populations. Conclusion: certain future changes are unavoidable but could be limited by deep, rapid and sustained global GHG emissions reduction based on the principle of climate justice. Therefore, mainstreaming effective and equitable climate action will not only reduce losses and damages, but will also provide wider benefits. ICMR releases guidelines for artificial intelligence use in the health sector. GS Paper 2. Syllabus: issues relating to development and management of social sector services relating to health. Context: the Indian Council of Medical Research, ICMR, has released ethical guidelines for AI in healthcare and biomedical research to guide the effective, safe development, deployment, adoption of AI-based technologies. Background: India has a host of frameworks which marry technological advances with healthcare. These include the Digital Health Authority for leveraging digital health technologies under the National Health Policy, 2017, the Digital Information Security in Healthcare Act, DISHA, 2018, and the Medical Device Rules, 2017. Artificial intelligence, AI, has made inroads into every sector and healthcare is no exception. Diagnosis and screening, therapeutics, preventive treatments, clinical decision-making, public health surveillance, etc., are among the recognized applications of AI in healthcare. Since AI cannot be held accountable for the decisions it makes, an ethically sound policy framework is essential to guide AI technology development. Highlights of the guidelines: it outlined 10 key patient-centric ethical principles for AI application in the health sector for all stakeholders involved. These are accountability and liability, autonomy, data privacy, collaboration, risk minimization and safety, accessibility and equity, optimization of data quality, non-discrimination and fairness, validity and trustworthiness. The ethical review process came under the domain of the Ethics Committee, which assesses a host of factors including data source, quality, safety, anonymization, etc. Significance of the guidelines: the autonomy principle ensures human oversight of the functioning and performance of the AI system. It is also critical to attain informed consent from the patient on the physical, psychological and social risks involved. It aims to prevent unintended or deliberate misuse and cyber attacks and mandates a benefit-risk assessment by an ethical committee. It underlines the importance of regular internal and external audits to ensure the optimum functioning of AI systems. It acknowledges the widespread availability of appropriate infrastructure and thus aims to bridge the digital divide. Way ahead. Standard practices to make the AI-based solutions technically sound, ethically justified, and applicable to a large number of individuals with equity and fairness. All the stakeholders should adhere to these guiding principles to make the technology more useful and acceptable to the users and beneficiaries of the technology.